And you can see there's a little stain just starting here. And that little stain there is what made me realise there was a leak on the injector. If we listen to the ISTA test plan, it tells us to replace the low pressure sensor. Well, we're not going to do that, are we? Because we're going to diagnose it properly. Here we've got a nice spray pattern. Well, kind of. But then we have this Lone Star. And this Lone Star one is not atomised, it's raw fuel and it ain't going to ignite the memory, man. So stick with me and I'll show you exactly, without an endoscope, what you need to see on live data, so you don't make the mistake of falling for a manufacturer's test plan, which was written probably by an engineer in some workshop, in some test centre, who's probably never picked up a spanner in his life, or her life. So let's go into this and let's diagnose it properly. Well, a bit of a different video for you this time. Rather than featuring an actual vehicle, this is one that we did work on, but this is going to be more of a kind of tutorial because I'm going to head more into that direction in the future. And what we've got is a young friend of mine today used a guided test plan on ISTA, which told him to replace the low pressure fuel sensor because there was a fuel pump plausibility fault code, and at some time when the engine runs, the fuel pressure is too low. However, when you look at this, it doesn't mention anywhere about the high pressure fuel sensor on the fuel rail. It simply only mentions that there is a problem with the low pressure sensor. Now, when you do the test plan, beware, because they're written by people we don't know about. They could be engineers, they could be car mechanics, but they're probably not. They're probably people who've come from university. I don't know. It's just literally a hearsay conjecture. I've heard about it from other people who work within these companies, that they are written in engineering departments. You have a software department and then you'll have the engineering department. They don't always basically pass on the right information, and sometimes things get literally lost in translation. So beware of guided fault finding. Use them at your peril. What we really need to do is we need to use our brains. We need to look at the data. We need to look at everything like a police detective, and only then can we make an educated guess, because we are better than machines, are better than computers. Best person to fix it is the fault finder themselves. And they really tie people up in knots. So this one today we're going to go through, what you're going to learn from this video is how to use live data, and also how to use the borescope to confirm that you've got, say, a fuel leak, like in this case, and how to interpret fault codes. And here's the fault code list right now on the screen. And you can see straight away there you've got what I just mentioned about fuel pump plausibility. But as you can see, just there, you've got also misfire fault codes as well. And that's a big clue, isn't it? Because if you think you've got a misfire, and then we look at the coils, which were dated from the year 2022, so not really, they're not going to be faulty, are they? No track marks on the coils. What we did do though is we pulled the plugs out of it, and cylinder 2, cylinder 3, plugs were black. They smelled of fuel. Job done. So let's go through that one more time without me talking. I'll show you the video in slow motion. It's pretty cool. You can see the valves opening in slow motion. You can see the injector. But I'll just talk you through the stain that I saw when the engine was switched off. It wasn't one of those injectors what leaks immediately. So let's have a look at that. Replay the slow motion version of that again. Just take a look at that intake valve. It's absolutely completely saturated with oil and carbon, and you must pay attention to that, because on engines such as the N43, N53, it can cause a bit of a misfire, can that, and it can reduce the cross-sectional area of the valve throat, and then you get an air mass fault. Just something to bear in mind. Well, there we have got a nice 5 bar there, and it's a good sign, or is it? Well, we need to know, have we really got 5 bar? There's lots of ways to do it, but you know, we're trying to do things the easiest way. That's always the best way when you're starting in the diagnostic game. You basically get your spanner and undo the sensor and take precautions against the fuel spraying everywhere. Leave it connected electrically. In this particular vehicle, we did that and gradually reduced the fuel pressure, and we got a reading of 0 bar, which means it's a good sensor in that sense, or at least at the time of test. If you have a bad sensor, such as this one here on the right, you can see fuel has leaked past the ceramic membrane and it's gone inside and basically melted it. You'll have all sorts of sporadic weird values that don't make sense because everything's breaking down electrically. Another way of doing it is to reduce the pressure on number 1 fuel injector and put a cloth around it and watch the rail pressure drop as you do so. So there are lots of ways of verifying that. You can even use a 5-volt circuit as you've seen in some of my other videos and introduce your own power and watch it rise and fall on the DME. But in this case, there's no need to do that. We want to stick to simplicity. So in this case, if you've got a bad sensor, change it. If you've got leaking injectors like we had in this particular case, change them. And what we'll do now, we'll go through the fault codes and I'll try and give you a synopsis and an explanation of what ISTA was thinking when it set the fault codes and why it sets them. So let's take a look at our first fault codes, which was the misfires on cylinder 2 and 3, and we'll break this down like a detective. The unmetered fuel leak caused that, and the DME will get feedback from the NOx sensors, picking up pre-ignition, pinking, whatever, but also the crankshaft sensor, because the velocity will fall. It will actually misfire, and the speed, rotational speed of the crankshaft will be much less because it just can't burn the fuel because it's just too raw. There's not enough vapor in there. Then we have a problem with the mixture control because the DME is trying to lean it out via oxygen sensor feedback, pre-cat. It can see that it's absolutely too rich, so it's going to try and lean it off. When it can't lean it off anymore because the fuel leak is so huge, it'll set a fault code for mixture control. So that's what that one decoded for you, 0029E0. Then we had the fuel pump plausibility, which our wonderful test plan told us to change a low pressure fuel sensor, which it wasn't, it was leaking injectors. However, as we've seen from the previous images, you can have faults with those particular sensors and they are quite common. So if you do what I said and make sure and rule out the sensor, you can change it or not change it as fate would have it. But one word of warning with those sensors, they can be very sporadic. They can work for days, months, and then stop working. Once that fuel gets in, it's a nightmare. So just change it. They're not expensive if you basically think that it's faulty. Then we had the issue that it can't achieve lambda 1 because basically it's pumping raw fuel in the exhaust system and you've got hydrocarbons in there. So it just can't achieve stoichiometric. And the last one I put was the NOx sensor unhappy because this engine actually runs a lean cycle. It basically has a lean map on it and it will run very, very super lean. And when things do run lean on these engines, they don't really use the oxygen sensor anymore. They rely on the feedback from the NOx sensor in that case. Of course, when the engine runs homogeneous, which is basically lambda 1, stoichiometric, it will use all of the oxygen sensor feedbacks. So that's just something to bear in mind from those fault codes. That's kind of how we break the fault codes down. And when you can do that, you can identify the problem and you can see it's all a chain of events that causes one single issue, which in this case was an issue with poor running from the injectors. Let's take a look now at the fault chain order. It's not absolutely accurate. It's as accurate as I can kind of work out. But we look at the first one. Obviously, we had a misfire on 2 and 3. So via the crankshaft position sensor, the DME is going to pick up that we've got an issue there. Then it's going to look at the feedback from the oxygen sensor. Obviously, if you've got a really rich running system, it's going to think there is an issue, and then it's going to set a flag for mixture control because it's going to have to lean off the mixture or the so-called fuel trim. And in this case, if memory serves me correctly, the reduction of fuel was 20%, or it was trying to achieve a reduction of 20% of the amount of injected fuel. And it does that by altering the injector duration, of course. And the reason it needs to do that is it thinks there is an issue with too much fuel. So it's literally going to try and lean off the mixture because its whole purpose in life, that DME, is to make sure the exhaust emissions are stoichiometric or lambda 1. Similarly, you have an issue then with the nitrogen oxide sensor needs to communicate with the DME because it has its own little control unit, if you've ever seen a NOx sensor, and it's connected on a local CAN bus. And that needs to know at which point the engine can stop using stoichiometric mode via the oxygen sensor feedbacks and then switch to lambda 2, lambda 3, however lean it needs to be in so-called stratified mode, as these engines run stratified, lean, homogeneous, normal lambda 1 mode. So it can't do that, so it sets a fault code because there's a feedback issue. So that's one thing that you need to bear in mind, the reason why you have this type of fault code structure. Also, you have the actual fuel pump plausibility. It deduces at some point that there was an issue with the fuel pressure on the low side, perhaps being not compatible with the emissions on the vehicle. As we could see, we've got really rich emissions. It needs to know why that's happening. And at some point also, although we don't really know, the snapshot data did show it, there was occasions where there was issues sort of intermittently with that low pressure sensor. So that's basically everything in a nutshell, and that's kind of how you would decode fault codes. And it always tells a little bit of a story. They don't just appear for no random reason. They generally are a fault chain, which is why I decided to call this little bit of the video the fault chain. So that's pretty much it.